This chapter on nutrition and metabolism goes hand in hand with the digestive system chapter and also some of the information we learned early on in molecular and cellular biology in AMP1. Before I jump into this, this is kind of a short lecture because much of this is repeat of what we've had. So I don't think you'll see that there's a whole lot new in this, but before I jump into this, I wanted to mention a couple of things that I think I may have left out in speaking about the anatomy of the digestive system and some of the physiology. One of the things was, I don't think I mentioned the appendix or actually pointed it out to you. It's definitely on your lab, that assignment that you will have for the digestive system. The appendix is a vestigial organ, meaning that in human beings, it's an organ that really we don't see having much of a function any longer. Once upon a time, it certainly did. And in comparative species that are very similar to Homo sapiens, humans, that tissue actually acts as part of an active part of the immune system. But in humans, it no longer really has a function that we are really well aware of. And that appendix that is on the inferior side of the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestines, the colon, is in a place that if it becomes inflamed and even ruptures is a life-threatening event. So appendicitis is a life-threatening occurrence, and it has to be dealt with immediately as an emergency before it ruptures, hopefully, because you wouldn't want to be spilling the microorganisms that should be isolated inside the lumen of the colon into the peritoneal space. That peritoneal space should be sterile. And if it's not, as I said, that wouldn't be compatible with life. So that's the appendix. I don't think I actually said it out loud talking about the anatomy of that. But the other thing I didn't mention was an infection that is fairly common now. It's called C. diff infection. The C stands for the genus Clostridium, and diff is abbreviating the species name difficile. So the microorganism, the bacteria that causes a C. diff infection is called Clostridium difficile. And this is when there's an imbalance in all those bacteria that should be filling the colon, and those bacteria are our friends and should be working for us to finish out the digestive and absorptive process of for nutrition. But C. diff, if it starts predominating or taking over in the colon, causes a very serious illness, and this is sometimes referred to as pseudomembranous enterocolitis because it does cause the lining to become inflamed and like slough off. So people have really a lot of diarrhea with this. It can, a dozen times a day or more, and it can also cause pain in the abdomen. So it's painful. It's really kind of debilitating, these C. diff infections. It's sometimes also referred to as antibiotic associated enterocolitis, and the reason it's called that is because we often see it after someone has been on prolonged antibiotic therapy. The antibiotic therapy may have been because of pneumonia or because of urinary tract infections or because of septicemia, whatever. The person had been on antibiotics long enough that it disturbed all of the microbes that were in their colon, so that C. diff Clostridium difficile could actually start taking over and take the opportunity to cause disease. It can be a really difficult infection to try to treat, and it can take weeks. You can see this catch-22 that it's a bacterial infection. So to treat it, you would give antibiotics. But antibiotics had often been the reason why it started in the first place. But so those antibiotic therapy is still used, and they try to control it. But there's also fecal enema therapy that is sometimes used as well. So you can look into that if you want to. Fecal transplants, they're called. So both of those options are actually today still actually being used for that infection. Now, to finish out the digestive system information, we're going to take a look at this chapter, which has a lot of what I said I think is redundant for you, but not a bad thing. So you see this little cycle here where glucose is being broken down, where oxygen is coming into the cell, and where carbon dioxide and water are being given off. This is aerobic respiration at its finest diagram here, with lots of ATP produced. Our cells have to have 24/7 energy because they never really get to stop, and with a lack of the ATP, the cells can actually start to suffer and start to die. So this is what we're going to look at. There are a couple of terms that I do think that might be new. So if I mention something that is new to you, make sure you jot those down. But when we think about body weight and energy balance, we tend to think about the calories in and calories out need to be balanced. And so when we think about nutrition, nutrition is taking in anything that can help with growth, regeneration, repair. So that's what we think about with what nutrition is, if something is nutritional. But we really need to also think about these energy demands. So about 30 to 50%, I wouldn't ask specifics here. There's a variation of individuals are due to heredity. So some people are bigger boned, some people are, have just a normal lower metabolism or higher metabolism. But most of the majority are because of eating and exercise habits. So that's usually it's behavioral when we think that somebody has a problem. As far as satiety, feeling full, having an appetite, but then also understanding that when your body is full, this is controlled by the hypothalamus. It would be really important that you knew that. The hypothalamus ruling and rocking our world, we saw. Orexin is a hormone. This orexin, again, something you want to list for, include in your hormone list. This stimulates intense hunger. We also have CCK that we have mentioned from the small intestines, cholecystokinin. This is an appetite suppressant. You can imagine that when chyme from the stomach is emptying into the duodenum, which releases the duodenum, the first part of the small intestines that releases, when that duodenum stretches and produces CCK, it just makes sense. You've just eaten a meal, so you need to suppress the appetite at that point. And it actually does. It works by doing that. We also know leptin is another hormone that's related to appetite and satiety centers. So neuropeptide Y is from the hypothalamus, is an appetite stimulant, but from the fat cells themselves, leptin it's inhibited by leptin. So this shows you a little picture of a cat with a ferocious appetite and one loss, and just FYI for you, in understanding that it really is the hypothalamus that controls our appetite centers here. So if you have lesions in this medial part toward the midline, ferocious appetite, lesions on the outer part of this, a loss of appetite. Calories, I don't ask you this definition, this chemical definition, but in chemistry you did learn that 1 calorie is the amount of heat that's required to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. I don't ask you that. But anyway, a kilocalorie is 1,000, because we know kilo is a prefix that means 1,000. So a kilocalorie means 1,000 calories in chemistry. What I do think that is important to know is that fats have about 9 kilocalories, so 9,000 per gram when oxidized, where carbohydrates have less than half. Carbohydrates and proteins both have less than half of that. So when we think about how many fats percentage-wise you should take in versus how much protein and carbs you take in, that's something to be considered. Fats already have more than twice the amount of kilocalories than carbs and proteins do. So nutrients, again, this definition is anything that's used for growth, repair, or maintenance. And these are some of the things we think about that are nutrients. Water for sure. Okay, carbs, lipids, proteins, you've heard all these before, minerals and vitamins. So they would be important. Those macronutrients, those large amounts, these are what you see on your food labels, right? Carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. These macronutrients that you need a lot of. Micronutrients, smaller amount. RDA, the recommended daily allowance for what people should take in. These are changing all the time, and this is nutrition is almost like a science that we're just on the cusp of understanding, because every individual is so different. So there's not a one size plate fits all. There used to be a food pyramid, but that food pyramid was replaced by like 13 different types of plates, depending on things from your inheritance to your blood type to there are all kinds of factors that come into play, and every person is really very, very different. So because of that, the RDA requirements now, they're not adhered to quite as religiously as we had thought to adhere to them in the past. I do want you to hear this term called essential versus non-essential, okay? Because you'll hear about nutrients being either essential or non-essential. It's important to understand that distinction. It doesn't mean that the non-essential aren't required. You actually need those too. But essential nutrients are the ones that the body can't make. So it means that if you are deficient in your diet of those essential nutrients, it means your body's going to be deficient in them. Let me give you an example, and this is just for the category of proteins. In proteins, you all have learned that there are 20 different amino acids that build your proteins. They are the monomers that build that polymer called proteins. So you need all 20 of them to make sure that you can build all the different proteins that you need to make. There are about 8 of those, though. These 8 of those that actually you can't make. Your body can make from scratch, from elements scratch, can make 12 of those amino acids, but there are 8 that you can't make. So if you are deficient in those, you're going to be deficient in making the proteins that require those. And if you remember, cells are essentially just protein factories. Yes, cells make carbs and cells make lipids and cells make other things, but we are essentially protein factories. That is our most diverse and abundant category. We have got to have these essential nutrients. Same thing when we talk about essential minerals. We can make, our body is amazing at making a lot of what we need from basic individual elements, but we can't do all of it. So the ones that we can't do, these are referred to as essential nutrients, and we have to have them. Okay, carbs, I think you all know, is our cleanest, quickest source of fuel. We know that there are 2 cell types that depend on carbohydrates for ATP. They are your neurons, your nervous system, and your red blood cells that are delivering oxygen. So when you ever hear about people who are on like carb-free or carb-reduced diets, you understand that you have to be very, very careful here, because you have 2 sets of cells that are vital for homeostasis that are dependent on carbs. So doing a completely carb-free diet that makes no chemical sense at all. We also know that there are building materials. We learned that back in the chemistry section of this, and that most carbs are going to be coming from plants. We know that as well. Fiber is part of the carbohydrates. We need to have as much as 30 grams a day. This is one of those things that, again, I'm not going to ask you numbers, but people, it's believed that really a lot of people in today's modern diets are deficient in fiber. We're not really deficient in carbs. We're doing way too many carbs, but we're often deficient in the healthy carbs. There are empty carbohydrates that don't give you any nutritional value. They can give you some energy, but they don't. Remember, nutritional value meant that it's a nutrient if it can help with growth, repair, and maintenance. Just because it may be giving you a little energy doesn't mean it can help with growth, repair, and maintenance. So that's what they mean by empty carbohydrates. It can give you a little bit of energy, but it's not going to do much for you as far as growth, regeneration, and repair. So we really do need those. We need to have enough fiber, but you can actually have too much fiber. It's rare that we see that happening, but if you have too much fiber, it can interfere with some of the mineral absorption that you need, like iron and calcium. So lipids, people should have enough fats in their diet. Again, This is when you hear about fat-free diets. They make no sense at a chemical level for our cells and our cellular level, and they would not be healthy. The thing about fats, lipids, is sort of like the carbs. They're good ones and they're bad ones. So you want to have healthy lipids in your diet and not the bad fats, but you have to have enough fats, because if you think about, this is where we have our stored energy. We know that if you're not getting enough fats, you're going to be deficient in the fat-soluble vitamins. A, D, E, and K are all fat-soluble. So if you're not taking in fats in your diet, you're usually lacking these, which are necessary for cellular function. And again, so many important functions to think about. Structural components for your cells, your cell membranes, also acting as a whole class of hormones, and we know how important hormones are. So you don't want to be deficient in lipids. Again, there are good ones and there are bad ones. When we think about unsaturated fats, those are the healthier ones. Saturated fats tend to come from animal sources, where unsaturated fats come from plants and animals, and they are the healthier ones. When we think about cholesterol, cholesterol gets a bad name, but it's not all bad. It's just that we can make most of what we need without eating high cholesterol foods. When we eat high cholesterol foods, then we're just going to have to process them out. And if we don't have the ability to do that, they're going to build up in our bloodstream, and that's not going to be a good thing. As far as carbohydrates go, the high-density lipoproteins are the good ones. They're the happy. They're the ones we want to have a lot of. But the low-density lipoproteins are the bad ones. So the high-density lipoproteins are the ones that actually transport these low ones and get them out of your system. Sometimes they're transporting them into your cells, and that helps to get them out of the bloodstream. So if you don't have the transporters, then typically these are going to be building up in the system, causing atherosclerosis, and can cause hardening of the arteries, plaque formation. These are in cardiovascular disease. So when we look at cholesterol levels, the total number, we need to break it down by these percentages. And then looking at those percentages, you get what is called a cardiac risk factor. And that's generated for you by the pathology department. So that's going to be on the lab report. But that's how they figure out, like, you can actually have a total cholesterol of less than 200 milligrams per deciliter, which is sort of that line that people think they just want to be below. But I've seen people have significantly below and still be at high cardiac risk. How? Because most of the number is the bad kind. So again, I've seen people with higher than 200 milligrams per deciliter who are low cardiac risk factor. Why? Because most of that number is the high density lipoproteins. So that's how it's calculated. And we know that lipids, we just learned that lipids are going to be absorbed into the lymph, and then it's going to eventually move to the lymphatic system until it is back into the bloodstream. Proteins. Proteins have so many functions. We are essentially protein factories. We understand all of these functions. This is all repeat for you, but we have we understand that we need to have all of a good, healthy, balanced diet so that we can get those 8 essential amino acids that are required. So the RDA, I'm certainly not going to show you this because we think this is probably too low for most people now. This has already changed. But people should have enough proteins in their diet. A balanced diet. Carbs, proteins, lipids. Where do we get them from? You can see some of the places that we get protein from. There are a lot of vegetables that are also rich in proteins, but again, you have to be kind of careful with that to make sure if you are vegan or vegetarian that you are getting the amount of proteins that you actually need. All right, so these are, I'm going to skip through something, if I'm skipping through it, it's just FYI. We do need vitamins. We said that A, D, K, and E are all fat soluble. C and B, these are going to be water soluble, so they're going to be absorbed no matter what even if you're not eating like you should. But anyway, the rest of these slides are things that we've talked about before, like glucose plus oxygen gives off CO2 and water, aerobic respiration. And this is the main way. Again, lots of slides relating to this. This is a typo here that should say oxygen, not CO2. But anyway, this is the way our cells get aerobic respiration, the way our cells get ATP. Glucose is the cleanest, quickest source of fuel. All kinds of different pictures that show you this sort of the same thing. We know that mitochondria is where the last two steps happen. Anaerobic fermentation, we can stay in it for short periods of time, but when we do, lactic acid will build up, and we understand that then we'll be in oxygen debt, and we need to get rid of that lactic acid. So, this is really, again, so many slides just talking about glucose and bringing in oxygen and getting ATP. Aerobic respiration, the cleanest, quickest source of fuel is going to be glucose. We can bring in fats and break it down, but the fats are, when we burn fats, it's going to give off ketone bodies. Those ketone bodies are going to change the pH, making us acidic, and then our body's going to have to try to buffer that back up. So it's going to take more and more work. We can also bring into this Krebs cycle, we can also break down proteins, but we should never be doing that for energy, because our proteins are needed for cellular, just cellular work and structural work. So we really shouldn't do that. Again, I'm not going to go into any more detail than what I've said here, and nothing that I've said I don't think has been new. So this is showing you where you can bring in actually lipids and fats, and we know triglycerides are fats, and bring them into the Krebs cycle to get energy as the byproduct, but it's going to produce these ketone bodies, which is going to cause our pH to be off. Okay, and this talks about this. Again, we can bring proteins in, but we should never be breaking down proteins. That's almost a wasting kind of disease when somebody's breaking down proteins. You see this in the later stages of cancers and those types of debilitating diseases where muscle mass is being lost because you're just using everything you've got for energy at that point. Urea is a byproduct. We learned this is a byproduct of proteins breaking down. The liver actually converts ammonia to urea, which is then removed by the kidneys. We saw this in the urinalysis section. If the kidney's not functioning and able to do this, we can sometimes see ammonia being building up in the system, and again, a problem with that. So we think about, I'm not going to ask about the absorption state, but we typically everybody's a little bit different, about 4 hours during and after a meal. So that's about how long the cell process is taking. And again, we understand how insulin is secreted when there's a rise in glucose in the bloodstream after a meal. Insulin will be secreted so that it'll bring those blood glucose levels back down. And, that's really kind of all. I don't think there was really much of anything new except mention of a couple of hormones in the beginning. Metabolic rate, when we think about this is the rate and the amount of energy used in a given period of time. And when we think about that, that's just all the chemistry that's happening in the cells at any given period of time. The factors that can affect your metabolic rate, almost everything can. Fever, eating, anxiety, depression, pregnancy, sleeping. Anything that you're doing is affecting your metabolic rate because your nervous system is sending a signal that is going to actually help trying to control that. So anyway, when we think about thermoregulation, hypothermia is excessively low, hypo meaning low temperature, and it's going to slow metabolism. Activity is going to be slow, and it can actually, if it's too low, obviously the temperature, it can lead to death. Hyperthermia the same way, excessively high body temperature, and then that can interrupt the protein structures that are held together. Remember the tertiary and secondary structures that are held together by hydrogen bonds. Heating hydrogen bonds, which are really, really weak, breaks the structure. So now you've lost your protein. You've lost your protein activity, the ones that were acting as catalysts, keeping things going fast. And now you're having to rebuild them again, which can get you to make you become even hotter. So we talked about positive feedback loops. When someone's fever goes too high, you don't want it to go too high because you can't get in that positive feedback loop. So thermoregulation is just the ability to make sure that you can keep it balanced within a homeostasis type of environment. You know, I think people understand there are different types of ways that you can measure. Typically, when you're taking someone's temperature, you're actually either doing oral or skin, under the arm. So you're typically doing shell temperature. Core temperature is definitely warmer, and that's normal that it's warmer. But anyway, so that makes a difference where you're taking temperature. The way that we produce heat, if we, you know, anyway, heat comes from any of the chemical reactions that are actually occurring in the cells, and so we understand that that's going to be one of the major ways. It's going to be through muscles. We lose heat, you know, from a lot from our head, from our skin. So all of these things are how we lose heat. We can actually, you know, sweat. If a person has lost the ability to sweat, if they're in a warm situation and they're not sweating, that it can maybe sometimes be your first sign that they're actually in trouble there, because they've lost their homeostasis of being able to sweat. It is definitely a negative feedback loop. You know, when we're hot, we typically sweat. That's right, what we're supposed to do. When we're colder, we are typically shivering. And we're also usually doing things, behavioral things, when we're cold or hot, to make sure that we assist in that. That some, again, things that this can lead to. So fever is normal and it's protective up to a point, and you don't want it to go too high because of that potential for positive feedback loop, which would then have to be broken. So hyperthermia can lead to heat cramps because of electrolyte imbalances, which can then lead to heat exhaustion, which you can see signs of, like fainting, dizziness, hypotension, low blood pressure. That can then lead to a heat stroke, and that can lead to coma and death. Hypothermia, too cold, is slowing down the metabolism so much that the cells are then not producing any type of ATP, and then that's going to be a problem as well. So this was, I think, a short little 27-minute, a short lecture. I'm not going to have a quiz on this one. There's no quiz to follow this one. So I think most of this was repeat, sort of just pulling things together for you. I hope so. And that's all of our digestive system and nutrition section. Thanks.